truth of the Tathagata's words. Morning.
Good morning. Friday. Good morning.
There's a chapter in Dogen's Shobo Genzo titled Valley Sounds, Mountain Colors. In Dogen's writings, he tells the following story of Su Dongpo and how the poem at the heart of his Valley Sounds, Mountain Colors chapters came to be. So this is Dogen's writing here. In Song, China, there was a man who called himself Layman Dongpo. He was originally named Shi of the Su family. A literary genius, he studied the way of dragons and elephants in the ocean of awakening. He descended deep chasms and soared freely through the clouds. One night, when Dongpo visited Mount Lu, he was enlightened upon hearing the sound of the valley stream. He composed the following verse, which he presented to Chanzong. So now this is the poem. Valley sounds are the long, broad tongue. Mountain colors are no other than the unconditioned body. 84,000 verses are heard through the night. What can I say about this in the future? Seeing this verse, Chanzong approved his understanding. Dogen goes on to say, the valley sounds of Dongpo would refresh practitioners of later generations. How sad for those who miss the Dharma of the manifested body. The tongue does not take a break. The colors are beyond coming and going. During past springs and autumns, Dongpo had not seen or heard the mountains and waters. He saw and heard them for the first time that night. Bodhisattvas who study the way, open your minds to mountains flowing and to water not flowing. Dongpo had this awakening soon after he heard Chanzong talk about insentient beings speaking the Dharma. Although Dongpo did not leap when he heard Chanzong's words, towering billows flew into the sky upon his hearing the sounds of the valley. Was it the valley sounds or the tide of awakening that jolted Dongpo? This is still Dogen speaking. I suspect that Chanzong's voices of insentient beings speaking Dharma are resounding even now, still blended with the sounds of the night's stream. Who can fathom this water? Is it a bucketful, or does it fill whole oceans? In the end, let me ask you, was it Dongpo who was awakened, or the mountains and waters that were awakened? Who today sees right away with a clear eye the long, broad tongue and the unconditioned body? So that's the end of Dogen's comments. So let me read this poem one more time. Valley sounds are the long, broad tongue. Mountain colors are no other than the unconditioned body. 84,000 verses are heard through the night. What can I say about this in the future? I've looked at a number of different translations of Dongpo's poem. Some of them actually specify the long, broad tongue and the unconditioned body as being those of the Buddha. But I like the translations that don't specify the owner of these things. I like ownership being left unsaid. The valley streams and the mountain colors are simply the long, broad tongue and the unconditioned body. Stop. If you wish, you can fill in your own owner, whatever is meaningful to you. Or you can just leave it open-ended. Leaving it open-ended seems to me to be more consistent with the Taoist influence in Zen, which, greatly paraphrasing, says, if you can name it, that's not it. We don't have to actually live in the valleys to hear the long, broad tongue of the valley streams. The 84,000 verses can be heard anywhere if we're tuned into them. Ever since I encountered this poem, it comes to my mind frequently, even just at home, engaged in my everydayness. I live in a very wooded neighborhood. Now, when I hear the sound made when the wind blows through the leaves of the trees, I experience this as a Dharma talk, being expounded by the long, broad tongue. It's not just the wind making the sound, neither is it just the leaves. It's both of them together, their interconnectedness. Sounds made by birds are another frequent way I hear the long, broad tongue speaking in my neighborhood. I've read that birds are the closest ancestors to dinosaurs we have today. While being surrounded by trees and hearing the various sounds of birds all around, all mostly unseen, just a symphony of sound filling the air, it doesn't seem like it takes much imagination to transport yourself back hundreds of millions of years to the age of the dinosaurs. One sound in particular that I hear a lot, just being in my own house, is the song of cardinals. As my awareness of their song has increased, so has my marvel at it. The texture of their sound is so full and pure, there's no clang or harshness in it at all. It's a perfect tone, and it's so loud to come from such a little creature. My understanding is that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and that the first living cells emerged when the Earth was only 500 million years old, or 4 billion years ago. Now when I hear the perfect sound of cardinals, I think to myself that that little sound, which can be easily not heard or taken for granted, took 4 billion years to create. That's a sutra. Dong Po's poem reminds us that these kinds of things are being expounded to us everywhere if we have the ears to hear them. The sounds of power tools and cars moving on the roads are other sounds heard in my neighborhood. We tend to think of these types of things as being man-made and not considered natural. But one author I read makes the point that humans are just as natural as any other animal. We consider a nest built by a bird to be natural. If humans are just as natural as birds, why would we not consider things created by humans to be natural too? If we think of things this way, then lawnmowers and chainsaws are also the long, broad tongue expounding the Dharma. One day, a short time back, I was sitting in my house, reading in my normal reading chair, and I took a pause in reading and lifted my head and turned to one of my windows. And the bottom 1/4 of the window was open, but I had the blinds closed on the upper 3/4 to block the sun and try and keep the room naturally cool. At the exact time I looked out the window through this bottom 1/4 of the window, there was this perfectly uniform distribution of this showering of those little twirling things that fall from the trees. I don't know what you call them. You know, and it was just perfectly uniform across that whole little section that I could see. And if I could have captured that with a camera, I thought it would have been a very unique photograph. It lasted about 15 seconds and then it stopped. A gust of wind must have caused it to fall. On the one hand, this was a very ordinary thing. But now, since this poem has made its way into my awareness, I felt like I experienced it as a manifestation of the unconditioned body, a moving picture perfectly and spontaneously framed by my window. Another aspect of the unconditioned body that is striking to me is the depth and vibrancy of color. The blueness of the sky, the greenness of the leaves and grasses, and all of the purples, reds, yellows, oranges, and all the other colors we see in nature. It doesn't seem to me that any creation of paints, no matter how high quality, match the depth of color of the unconditioned body. Regarding the line, 84,000 verses are heard through the night, I like to think of this as reminding us that the long, broad tongue never stops teaching. Sutras are constantly being expounded, even in the quietest moments in the night. Silence itself is a sutra. I also think that this can be applied to moments in our lives when we think nothing is happening. We're not moving forward. We feel stagnant, maybe anxious, depressed, confused. We're in our own dark night of the soul. This line can remind us that there is still Dharma in these moments and sutras being expounded. Maybe we can't consciously identify what they are, but maybe we don't have to. Maybe it's enough just to have faith that something is happening, even if we don't know exactly what that is. And then the final line, what can I say about this in the future? This implies to me that the sutras expounded by the long, broad tongue and the unconditioned body are beyond words and thought. We don't need to try and cage them up into words and thoughts. It's impossible for the cages of words and thoughts to contain a dharma that's boundless. We just have to let it flow through us and resonate with our deepest nature. In a short biography I read on Dong Po, the author speaks to this. So this is a quote right from the author of the biography. Rather than consciousness giving shape to the world it encounters, Dong Po's poems enact consciousness wandering like water, taking shape according to what it encounters. Dong Po's mastery of this selfless poetics derives in part from his lifelong devotion to Chan. For Chan, or Zen, no mind mirrors whatever it encounters with perfect clarity. But, as with water, there is an inner nature to the poet which endures through all of the transformations. This enduring nature is known in Chinese as Li, translated as the inner pattern. For the poet Xie Ling Yun, the inner pattern was primarily manifested in the empirical world, and the goal of poetry was to render empty mind mirroring the vast dimensions of the inner pattern in the mountains and rivers realm. But Dong Po's poems weave together the empirical world and wandering thought, and for him, both aspects are manifestations of the inner pattern. Here, wilderness is not simply out there in the mountains. It is always already here within us as well. Consciousness is itself already wild. So every gesture in a poem is wilderness, whether it is a turn of thought or a heron taking flight. That's the end of the quote. So the first idea expressed in this excerpt, that rather than consciousness giving shape to what it encounters, consciousness wanders like water and takes the shape of whatever it encounters. Hearing it put that way has had a strong impression on me. I also really like the idea of consciousness being wild. There's a freedom, vitality, and exuberance in that. We don't have to go anywhere to experience wilderness. The wisdom of wilderness is already with us. Consciousness is not static, confined, and separate, but rather free-flowing, wild, and merged with whatever it encounters. There's life in that. The second idea expressed in this excerpt is that Dong Po's poems weave together the empirical world and wandering thought, and both aspects are manifestations of the inner pattern, which to me is another way of expressing the oneness of the relative and the absolute. In our terminology, we might look at the inner pattern as emptiness, the absolute nature, or unity. I read a different translation of the Heart Sutra recently, and in that translation, the word boundlessness is used instead of emptiness. This translation was by Kazuaki Tanahashi and Joan Halifax, two extremely reputable practitioners. In fact, the more I read translations from Tanahashi, the more I like them. In this translation, it says, "O Shariputra, boundlessness is the nature of all things." This translation can be very encouraging to us when we are living, because it is telling us that our path is ultimately completely open. Any walls that confine us or obstructions in our way are not permanent, and in many instances are very likely caused by ourselves. To me, this translation is also comforting when I think about my own death. To think of ourselves, or to help others view themselves, as being boundless seems to me that this would be a very comforting mental state to rest in as the end draws near. So finally, I'll just conclude and end this talk with another recitation of his poem, but with a slightly different translation. A murmuring stream is the tongue, broad and unending. And what is mountain color, if not the body pure and clear? 84,000 gathas fill a passing night, but still, once day has come, how could I explain them to anyone?
May the merit of this penetrate into each thing in all places, so that we and every sentient being together can realize the Buddha way. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them. Desires are inexhaustible. I vow to put an end to them. The dharmas are